Now that we've considered the importance of the center, it's time to look at some general principles on how to open a chess game. The do's and don'ts, just general guidelines, things you should do, things you should not do. One we've already talked about, you should develop your pieces as quickly as you can. They can't do anything while they're at home on the back rank. You want to get them out and into the game. So here's an example of how both players can develop, not just toward the center, but doing other useful things as well. For example, after e4, the pawn occupies the center and influences d5, trying to prevent black from putting a piece or a pawn on the d5 central square. Black follows suit by playing e5, influencing d4. Knight f3 for white attacks the black pawn on e5. So this is doing something useful as well as developing toward the center, influencing center squares. It's also developing with another idea in mind, which we'll talk about a little bit later. After knight f3, knight c6, black defends the pawn as well as influences the central square d4. Bishop c4 influences the center, tries to keep black from putting a piece on d5. Bishop c5 influences the center, trying to keep white from using d4. Then we have castling, which is a defensive move. It gets the king out of the center, but it's also a developing move. Now the rook on f1 can swing over to e1 and get involved in the action. Black plays knight f6, doing two things, attacking the pawn on e4 as well as influencing d5. And now white plays d4, putting a pawn in the center and attacking both black's bishop and e5 pawn. So these are good central developing moves for both players. Whenever you can, you should develop with a threat. Make a good developing move toward the center that threatens something of your opponent's. Here's a really easy, simple example, which is e4, black plays e5, and then knight f3. The knight comes toward the center, influences two central squares, d4 and e5, and it attacks black's pawn on e5. Black has to do something about this threat. White is doing something called maintaining the initiative, which means that if you make moves that demand a response from your opponent, he doesn't have time to go ahead with his own plans. He's dancing to your tune, and that means you have the initiative. So after knight f3, black has to do something to defend the pawn, but he does something really good, which is knight c6. A good move toward the center, influencing two central squares, in fact the same two that the white knight influences, and it guards the pawn on e5. Here's another a little bit more involved example of developing with a threat from an old correspondence game from the 1960s. After e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, knight to d4, bishop c4, c6, knight takes on d4, e-pawn takes on d4, d3, black plays g6, and now white develops with a threat. The queen comes to f3, and the threat is checkmate. Unless black does something to stop it, the queen can take on f7, and the black king will be mated. So white has developed with a threat. The queen comes to f3, threatening checkmate on the move. Another good development tip is to develop your pieces to secure squares. That is, squares where they're not easily kicked off of that square by your opponent's moves. For example, after e4, d6, knight f3, bishop g4, pinning the knight, white can play h3. Pawn to h3 kicks that bishop off of g4. Now the bishop either has to take the knight or retreat. Another example would be after e4, e6, d4, knight f6. That's a great square for the knight, except that after e5, the pawn kicks the knight off of f6. So try to get your pieces to squares where your opponent can't easily dislodge them, can't easily kick them off of those squares. Get them out to secure squares. Sometimes, even after you bring a piece to a secure square, you have to take some extra time and trouble to make sure that that square stays secure, or at least make sure that the piece has a retreat in case it gets in a jam. Here's an example from one of my own games, and I'm not using this game because it's a great game or a classic. It's none of that, but I'm using it because I remember what my opponent did in this game. He started by playing e4, I played c6, he played knight c3, I played d5. Now, my opponent at this point should have done something to make sure that the knight on c3 stayed on a secure square. An easy way to do that would have been to play d4. That way, my d-pawn would not be able to advance. But instead, he played d3 to prop up his own pawn on e4, and then after I played d4 myself, it kicked his knight off of c3. His knight should have come back to e2. That would have been a better move than what he actually played, which was knight a4. The problem is, right now that's a secure square, but it's not going to stay that way. I played e5 for my next move, and now my opponent should have done something to either secure that square for his knight or make sure his knight has a retreat. He could have played b2 to b3, so there's a pocket for the knight to drop back into. Or if he felt especially ambitious, he could have played a2 to a3 followed by b2 to b4, and then the knight could still drop back to b2. But what he played instead was knight f3. I played bishop g4, and it pins the knight. He plays h3. Now, of course, my bishop is not on a secure square. h3 kicks my bishop off. I have to do something with the bishop, so I took on f3 with my bishop. He plays queen takes f3, and now I hit his knight with b5. And now we see the problem with the knight. The knight on a4 has nowhere it can go that's a safe square. It has no retreat. It has no secure squares to go to. a4 is suddenly not a secure square, and no other square the knight can go to is secure. For example, if the knight goes to b6, my a-pawn can take it. If the knight goes to c5, my bishop can take it. If the knight drops back to c3, my d-pawn can take it. So the knight has nowhere to go. What white should do here is just develop another piece, because that knight is lost. If I have to play b takes a4, I have doubled a pawns, and that's a weakness. Both of those pawns become weak. Instead, he played knight c5, which just helps me, because now I can develop and take his knight off at the same time and wind up a piece ahead. Just because he did not make sure, after he moved his knight to a4, he didn't make sure he had a place to bring the knight to that was a safe spot. And even before that, after knight c3, he didn't make a move that would make sure that knight would stay on a secure square.